In our second lecture, we would like to discuss another important piece of legislation relating to right to fair compensation in case of land acquisition, rehabilitation, and resettlement, and the very act was enacted by the Indian Parliament in 2013. So, in that case, we would like to trace the very development in relation to the enactment of the act and the very objective and scope, then the very provisions in context of landowners consent in regarding land acquisition, rehabilitation, and resettlement, and also regarding the very compensation. And besides that, also in relation to rehabilitation, their social impact, and their very return of unutilized lands to those from whom the land was acquired. So also we'll discuss about those amendments of 2014 and 15 and the very impacts and challenges such as the opposition from industrial houses and by the political parties and inadequate compensation and rehabilitation. Besides that, disputes over land ownership, and in that connection, we'll make a case study relating to Navi Mumbai International Airport. Then finally, would like to conclude our lecture with this important landmark enactment enacted in 2013, and that is right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation, and Resettlement Act 2013. And it is a law enacted by the Parliament of India to regulate the process of land acquisition for public purposes, aiming to provide fair compensation and ensure transparency in the process, as well as provide for the rehabilitation and resettlement of those affected by land acquisition. And it replaced the previous enactment, that was Land Acquisition Act of 1894, which was enacted during the British period. And the very right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation, resettlement act 2013 commonly was created to bring fairness and openness to land acquisition across India. And in 2015, an amendment was made to the act. So, the very history of Land Acquisition Act 2013 regarding rehabilitation and resettlement was replaced the outdated Act of 1894, and the present Act aims to create a fair, even, and transparent process for acquiring land for development, and while protecting the rights of landowners and affected families. The Act stresses proper consultation, rehabilitation, and discussion in the Parliament. So, in 2015, certain amendments were introduced to change and relax some provisions of the existing Act of 2013. So, the Act is a law enacted by the Indian Parliament to regulate the process of land acquisition for public purposes. The Act was introduced as a response to concerns about the forcible acquisition of land from farmers and rural communities without adequate compensation and rehabilitation measures. So the Act aims to balance the interest of the government, landowners, and commercial users by providing a transparent and fair process of acquisition. So the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013 stands out because it ensures that landowners and families affected by acquisition are given much more than the usual market price for their land. In addition to financial compensation, the law provides structured rehabilitation and resettlement measures to reduce the hardship of displacement. One of the core requirements of the Act is the social impact assessment, which carefully studies how the acquisition will affect local people and communities. This process also involves consultation and participation from the public, making decision making more transparent. Another important safeguard built into the Act is the protection of agricultural land, recognizing its value for food security. By including these measures, the Act aims to make the process even consultative and inclusive. It changes the idea of acquisition from one sided loss to shared development, helping affected individuals become partners in the growth rather than victims of progress. So, the very objective and scope of the Act are to ensure that the process of land acquisition is done in a just and transparent manner, and that the landowners receive fair compensation and rehabilitation and resettlement measures. The Act covers the acquisition of land for public purposes, which includes the construction of government projects such as government buildings, roads, railways, airports, and other infrastructure projects for developmental purposes. So, the very key provisions of the Act we would like to discuss. One is the requirement of consent of landowners. The Act requires that the consent of at least 70% of landowners be obtained before the acquisition of land for public purposes. In the case of public private partnership, the consent of at least 80% of the landowners is required. And the second important provision is relating to compensation and rehabilitation. The Act provides for fair compensation to landowners, which is at least twice the market value of rural land and at least four times the market value of urban land. The Act also provides for adequate rehabilitation and resettlement measures to be taken before the acquisition of land. And the third most important provision relating to the Act is social impact assessment. The Act requires that a social impact assessment be conducted before the acquisition of land. The assessment evaluates the potential impact of the acquisition on this local community and recommends measures to minimize the adverse impacts. And the fourth important provision relates to return of unutilized land. The Act provides that any land acquired but not utilized for 5 years should be returned to the original landowners or the state governments. So, regarding that, we would like to discuss some important changes made, such as the amendment of 2014 The Act was amended to remove the requirement of social impact assessment for certain projects such as defense projects and projects concerning rural infrastructure. The amendment also exempted irrigation projects from the requirement of seeking consent from the landowners. And the 2015 amendment to the Act was to include provisions that would provide for higher compensation to farmers in case the land acquired is sold later at a higher price. So now we will discuss those impacts and challenges. The act had significant impact on the process of land acquisition in India. Before the act, the land acquisition was often done without the consent or adequate compensation of landowners, resulting in protest and legal disputes. Since the implementation of the act, the process of land acquisition has become more transparent and fairer, with landowners receiving adequate compensation and rehabilitation measures. However, the act has also led to delays and increased costs for developmental projects, which have had a negative impact on the economy. So, the very challenges that the Act faced regarding certain controversies, such as first one, opposition from industry or industrial houses and political parties who argue that it has led to delays and increased cost of for developmental projects. The second challenge is relating to inadequate compensation and rehabilitation measures. Some critics argue that the compensation and rehabilitation measures provided under the Act are inadequate and do not adequately protect the very interest of those landowners. And the third important challenge is relating to the very dispute over land ownership. Land ownership disputes often arise in India, which can lead to delays and legal challenges in the land acquisition process. So, in connection to that, we would like to discuss one important relevant case relating to this act is the Navi Mumbai International Airport case, as there have been several cases. We found so one of the prominent cases that we would like to discuss is of the Navi Mumbai International Airport, which faced delays due to land acquisition issues. However, after the implementation of the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013, the project was able to move forward with a transparent and fair process of land acquisition. So, now we would like to make a comparison with previous legislation. So, the Act of 2013, although replaced the Land Acquisition of Act of 1894, which was enacted during the British rule, which was considered archaic and did not adequately protect the interest of the land owners. The present Act introduced several new provisions to protect the rights of landowners and ensure a fair process of land acquisition. The present Act also required to consent of landowners before the acquisition of land, which was not a requirement under the previous Act that was enacted under the British rule and was known as the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. So, now we would like to discuss the very future and the implication that the Act had a significant impact on the process of land acquisition in India. While the act has led to delays and increased cost for developmental projects, it has also ensured that landowners receive fair compensation and rehabilitation measures. The future outlook of the act depends on whether it will continue to strike a balance between development and the rights of landowners. The implication for the economy and development projects in India will also depend on how effectively the act is implemented and whether its provisions continue to be updated to address emerging challenges. So now we would like to conclude our valuable discussion on this present piece of legislation enacted in 2013. So, the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013 has introduced several new provisions to ensure a fair and transparent process of land acquisition for public purposes. The Act has faced challenges and controversies, but its implementation has resulted in a more equitable process of landowners and commercial users alike. The future outlook of the Act depends on its effectiveness in addressing emerging challenges and continuing to balance the very interest of all stakeholders. So, hereby we conclude our lecture on this very enactment, that is Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013, and in particularly in the context relating to the right to fair compensation